Montana Territory, 1879, the wind howled low through the Bitterroot Valley, tugging at the hem of Adeline Pryor's worn skirt as she stood on the porch of the old ranch house, a rifle slung over one shoulder and a squirming toddler balanced on her hip. The boy's name was Gideon. He was 2 years old and his sister, Grace, only 4. Both had their father's dark hair and neither had seen him in months. Adeline tightened her grip on the rifle as a rider crested the hill beyond the pasture, sunlight flashing off the metal of his saddle buckle. Another drifter, probably. They always came through with dust in their beards and promises in their eyes, looking for work, a meal, or a woman to fix them. Then they left. She stepped forward, boots crunching on the dry earth, eyes sharp. The children had already been abandoned once by their father and by more than one man who claimed he would help. She would not let another lie take root in their hearts. The rider slowed his horse as he neared the gate, dismounted with a quiet ease, and met her stare without flinching. He was tall, lean, probably no older than 30. His skin was sun-browned, his jaw shadowed with travel. He looked like someone who had spent more time riding than sleeping. "You looking for work?" she asked flatly. He gave a single nod. "Name's Vaughn Keller." "I heard you had need of hands." "I do," she replied, "but I have children, and I do not have time for men who think they can come and go when it suits them." Vaughn's eyes drifted to Gideon, then to Grace, who peeked out from behind the porch post, her thumb in her mouth. He took his hat off, holding it respectfully in both hands. "I am not here to pass through," he said, voice low. "I came to stay if you will have me." Adeline studied him hard. He did not sound like the others, but then none of them had sounded like liars at first. "You gonna leave like the others?" she asked, her voice cracking with something she had not meant to let show. Vaughn's eyes softened just a little. "No," he said. "I came to stay." She did not answer right away. Instead, she pushed the gate open with her boot and stepped aside. "We start early. You eat what we grow, and I do not tolerate laziness." "Fair enough," he said, and led his horse through the gate. For the next few weeks, he worked without complaint, fixed the busted fence line, cleaned the stables, chopped wood without being asked. When the mule went lame, he carried water from the creek himself, shoulders straining under the weight but never asking for help. He kept to himself, mostly. Slept in the old bunkhouse. Ate dinner at the table but never lingered. But he was kind to the children. Grace warmed to him first, bringing him dandelions and asking him endless questions about horses. Gideon followed after that, waddling after Vaughn as he made his rounds. Adeline watched it all with cautious eyes. One evening near the end of August, the sky bruised with storm clouds, Grace came running up the path, breathless. "Gideon's stuck," she cried. By the creek, Adeline dropped the bucket she was carrying and ran, heart pounding, legs burning. Vaughn was already ahead of her, sprinting down the trail toward the gully. When she reached the creek, she saw Gideon clinging to a root, his small body dangling over the edge where the bank had crumbled. "Do not move, baby," she called, voice shaking. Vaughn did not hesitate. He threw himself down on his stomach, reached out, and caught Gideon just as the boy's fingers slipped. He pulled him close, held him tight for a moment, and then climbed back up with both of them muddy and breathing hard. Adeline rushed forward, taking Gideon into her arms, sobbing quietly into his hair. "You saved him," she whispered. Vaughn stood beside her, soaked through and scraped from the rocks. "I would never let anything happen to him," he said. They stood there a long time, the storm breaking overhead in a soft rain. That night something shifted. The next morning she found him in the barn, brushing down the mare. She crossed the dirt floor, stopped in front of him. "I used to think I had to do this alone," she said. "You do not," he said. "They never stayed." "I will." She looked up at him, and for the first time she let the walls slip, just a little. "Why?" she asked. "Because I see you," he said, "all of you. And I am not afraid of any of it." She reached out and touched his cheek, just once, her fingers trembling. He leaned into it, eyes never leaving hers, and that was the beginning, not of something rushed or reckless, but of something real, of something that would not leave. The first frost came early that year, curling over the fields like a silver breath. Mornings were quieter now, wrapped in mist and the hush of animals waiting to be fed. Vaughn had begun patching the roof before the cold set in deep, and each morning his boots were already muddy by the time Grace stirred beneath her quilt. Adeline found herself watching him more than she meant to. Not because she didn't trust him anymore, she did, in ways that startled her, but because of how steady his presence had become. He never asked what had happened to the children's father, never pushed into her silences, just worked beside her like he'd always been part of the land. That afternoon, she caught him kneeling beside the woodpile, showing Grace how to split kindling with a hatchet small enough for her hands. "She's not going to manage it if you keep doing half the swing for her," Adeline said from the doorway, arms crossed. "She's figuring it," he replied. "Knows more about balance than some grown men I've worked alongside." Grace grinned and brought the blade down again. The log cracked clean. Vaughn raised an eyebrow at Adeline. "Told you?" Later, as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, Adeline brought out 2 chipped mugs filled with coffee and handed one to Vaughn where he sat on the porch steps. She sat beside him without a word, their knees nearly touching. "You were born to this?" she asked after a long stretch of quiet. "No," he said. "Texas Plains. My father punched cattle until a fever took him. I left after that." "How old?" 17, rode north, hired on wherever I could. I took coin from men I didn't respect and slept under wagons more often than roofs." He sipped the coffee, eyes on the darkening line of hills. "I kept waiting to feel settled somewhere, but it never came." "It's not a feeling," she said. "It's a choice." He looked over at her then, something behind his gaze she hadn't seen before, not longing, not regret, just truth. "I'm choosing now." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night, after the children were asleep and the wind had risen into a low wail along the eaves, she found him in the barn again, checking the latch on the stall door. He turned when she entered, brushing hay from his sleeve. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "The wind always did that to me," he nodded. "Sounds like voices sometimes, makes it hard to tell what's real." They stood near the lantern light, shadows long against the wall. "I used to wait for him," she said quietly, "even after I knew better. I'd set out a second plate just in case." Vaughn didn't speak, but he didn't look away. "I was angry for so long, I forgot what it felt like not to be." "You're allowed to stop carrying that," he said. "I don't know how. I'll teach you." She stepped forward, slow, unsure. He didn't move. Her hand found his, calloused and warm, and her breath caught in her throat. "I've spent years keeping everyone at arm's length," she said, voice nearly breaking. "If I let you in, I'll stay." She nodded once, then leaned into him, her head against his chest. His arms came around her, careful, as if he knew she wasn't fragile but still needed gentleness. The barn creaked with the wind. The horses shifted in their stalls. Neither of them spoke again that night. When morning broke, there was a softness in her eyes she didn't try to hide. And when she handed him his coffee, her fingers lingered just a moment longer. Something had changed between them, not in words, but in the quiet trust that had grown in the spaces where loneliness used to live. The first snow came overnight. Vaughn woke before the light, the bunkhouse colder than it had been in weeks. He dressed by lantern glow, pulling on the thickest shirt he owned, then stepped outside into the hush of white. The world looked different under snow quieter held. Even the wind had softened. By the time he reached the main house, smoke was already rising from the chimney. He knocked once and stepped in when he heard her call. "Grace's boots are too small," Adeline said, without looking up from the stove. "She's grown again." "I'll ride into Corvallis tomorrow," Vaughn said. "Take the sled, might still be a few pairs at the mercantile." She turned then, brushing flour from her hands. "You don't have to, I know," he said simply. She looked at him a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." He took his coffee near the window, watching the yard disappear beneath falling snow. Grace was humming to herself at the table, drawing something with charcoal on a scrap of paper. Gideon sat in his high chair, cheeks round with biscuit crumbs. "You ever think about making this place bigger?" he asked after a while. Adeline raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting I add a ballroom?" He smiled into his cup. "Maybe just another room. Somewhere the kids can sleep without hearing every board creak." She considered that, her eyes drifting to the children. "Would take lumber and time." "I've got both." She didn't answer, but that night she left the door to the house unlatched behind her. The next day he rode out before sunrise, the sled runners whispering over packed snow. It took the better part of the morning to reach town, and by then the sky had turned a flat gray that promised more weather. Still, he found the boots one pair brown, the other dyed a faded red, and a few bolts of muslin Adeline might use come spring. At the counter, the shopkeeper squinted over his spectacles. "You the hand working Adeline Pryor's place?" Vaughn met his gaze. "I am. She's a stubborn one." Most folks figured she'd pack up after the second winter. She didn't. No, she didn't. The old man wrapped the boots in paper. "You staying on then?" Vaughn tied the twine tight. "That's the plan." By the time he made it back, the wind had picked up and the children were already asleep. Adeline met him on the porch, lantern in hand. "You didn't have to rush back in this," she said. "I said I'd be back by dusk." She took the bundle from him, her fingers brushing his. "Come in before you freeze." He followed her inside, shaking snow from his coat. She unwrapped the boots, running a thumb along the stitching. "These'll last her through spring," she murmured. "I figured red might suit her." Adeline looked up, the firelight catching in her eyes. "You see them clearer than most do." "I see you clearer too." She stepped closer, hands still on the paper. "You never ask about before, about their pa. I figured you'd tell me when it mattered." "It doesn't anymore," she said quietly. "Not the way it used to." The room felt warm in a different way then, not from the stove, but from the space between them narrowing. "I've been thinking," she said. "If you mean what you said about staying, then maybe it's time we stop pretending you're just passing through." "I stopped pretending the day I pulled Gideon up from that creek." She reached for his hand, folded it between hers. "I don't want the children growing up thinking love is something that leaves," she said. "And I don't want to keep my heart behind a locked door, hoping no one notices." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next year." She leaned forward, rested her forehead against his. He didn't move, just breathed in the moment like it was the first real air he'd had in years. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, two hands found each other and held fast, and neither of them let go. By mid-December, the snow had settled into the hills in thick layers, blanketing the fences and softening the sharp edges of the world. The mornings were dark longer, and the only sounds before dawn were the groan of wood beams shifting in the cold and the low rustle of the fire Adeline kept banked through the night. Vaughn had moved from the bunkhouse 2 weeks past without ceremony. His bedroll had simply found its way beside the hearth, and then, with quiet rightness, into the room across from the children. There'd been no discussion, no need. Things had a way of becoming true without needing to be said. That morning, Adeline stood at the table mending a tear along the hem of her coat while Vaughn coaxed the stove to life. His movements were practiced, now measured, sure. She watched him from the corner of her eye. "You ever hunt in deep snow?" she asked. He glanced over, rubbing his hands together over the heat. "Plenty, elk mostly, sometimes fox if the pelts fetch something. There's something taking chickens again. Tracks look too deep for a fox," he straightened. "You seen feathers or signs it's coming from the woods? Just claw marks by the roost, only at night." He reached for the rifle leaning by the door. "I'll set traps along the east slope. If it's a cat, we'll know by morning." Adeline tugged the thread tight. "You always this calm when something's after your stock," he gave a quiet shrug. "Can't panic a solution into place." Outside, the trees stood hushed and heavy with snow. Vaughn saddled the paint mare while Adeline packed a canvas bag with jerky and wrapped bread. She handed it to him without looking up. "If it's a cat, don't go alone. I'll take the dog," he said. "And keep to the lower ridge." She hesitated, then touched his arm. "Don't stay out past dusk." "I won't." She didn't know why it gripped her so hard, the thought of him gone too long in that cold. He'd proven himself a dozen times over, but something in her still braced when the door shut behind him. That afternoon, she kept busy sorting seed sacks, writing a list of what they'd need come spring. Grace practiced her letters on the slate while Gideon napped curled beneath a quilt. The quiet felt too wide without Vaughn's steady steps in the yard. When he returned near nightfall, his coat dusted white and a line of snow on his hat brim, she opened the door before he reached it. "Coyote," he said, stomping his boots. "Big one. Took 3 hens before it left a trail. You catch it?" "Not yet, but I found its path. It's circling from the gully. I'll stay out tomorrow night if I have to." Adeline took the rifle from him and leaned it by the door. "You'll eat first. Then we'll talk about sitting up in the cold all night." He looked down at her, snow melting on his collar, and something in his gaze settled deep into her. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked as they sat later, the children already asleep. "I think about fence lines, calving season. Maybe planting barley next year if we can keep the soil turned." She studied him. "That's not what I meant." He didn't answer right off. Instead, he looked toward the hearth where the fire had burned low. "I think about waking up here every day," he said finally. "About not having to ride out come spring." She leaned back in her chair, the lamp casting a soft golden light between them. "I never let myself think past the next storm, seemed safer that way." "I could build you a future, Addie," he said, quiet but certain. "One you don't have to brace against." She reached for his hand across the table. "Then let's build it slow. I've had enough things fall apart fast." His fingers closed over hers gently, and neither of them looked away. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the house in soft, sweeping gusts. But inside, there was only warmth and the quiet knowledge that nothing would be taken from them tonight. Not the fire. Not the steadiness between them, not the promise Vaughn had made and was already keeping. By early March, the snow had begun to pull back, inch by inch, revealing the brittle stubble of last year's fields and the long, furrowed trails of elk that had wandered close during the worst of the cold. The air still carried the sting of winter, but there were moments midday when the sun climbed high enough that almost felt like spring if you let yourself believe it. Adeline stood beneath the cottonwood by the well, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scraping the last of the soot from the iron kettle. Vaughn was nearby, driving the final post into the new paddock they'd planned through the long evenings. Gideon sat buckled into a canvas sling on her back, dozing against her spine, and Grace was crouched in the dirt, poking at a beetle. "You never say much about the places you pass through," Adeline said, eyes still on the kettle. Vaughn paused, leaned on the sledge. "Not much worth repeating. Towns that smelled of whiskey and sweat. People who never looked you in the eye long enough to remember your name. You ever leave anyone behind?" Her voice was calm, but her hands stilled. He didn't answer right away. "Then a brother, younger by 3 years. He stayed on after our father died, said I was chasing ghosts." "Maybe he was right. You ever think of going back?" "I used to. Thought maybe I'd ride down and see if he was still angry, but I reckon if I stayed gone this long, it's done." She rinsed the kettle, the water splashing cold against her boots. "I don't have anyone left either. You've got Grace and Gideon." "I meant before them." He crossed the distance between them slowly, boots sinking into the softened mud. "You've got me now," he said, her eyes met his, clear and steady. "I know." That afternoon, they worked together along the fence line, measuring the last stretch before the gate. When Grace wandered off toward the thicket at the edge of the woods, Adeline called her back with a sharpness that surprised even herself. "She's just chasing shadows," Vaughn said gently. "She doesn't know what could be in there. Neither did you once." Adeline looked away. "I learned fast. You don't have to teach her fear. Just how to listen." She was quiet after that, but when Grace returned with a fistful of wild crocus, she praised the color and tucked one behind the girl's ear. That night, after the children were tucked under quilts sewn from scraps of old shirts and feed sacks, Adeline stepped out onto the porch where Vaughn sat with his legs stretched, sharpening a blade against a whetstone. "Have you thought more about what we said?" she asked. He looked up. "About the land, about us," he set the blade aside, "every day. I don't want to raise them with someone who's still half looking toward the next trail." "I'm not," he said. "I've got both feet planted." She nodded. "Then I want to marry you, Vaughn." Plain and proper. For a moment he only looked at her, the firelight from the open door warming the edge of her face. "I was waiting for you to say it first," he said. "You were." "I didn't want to press. You've carried too much without anyone's help." I wanted you to know I'd stay no matter what. She stepped toward him, took his hand. I know that already. They wed before the first green shoots broke through the thawed ground. The preacher from Stevensville came in a wagon with his wife, and Grace wore a ribbon Adeline had dyed with boiled walnut husks. Vaughn stood beside her in his best shirt, hair neatly combed, hands steady as he took hers. There was no crowd, no music, just the wind moving through the fields and the sound of Gideon laughing as he tried to follow a chicken. Afterward, they shared bread and coffee and dried apples beneath the open sky. The preacher's wife held Grace on her knee and told her stories of when she was young, and Adeline leaned against Vaughn's shoulder the way a woman does when she no longer has to stand alone. By late spring, the paddock held 2 new calves and a mule foal with a crooked blaze. The children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing one another until the light stretched long across the earth. On warm evenings, Adeline and Vaughn sat on the porch while the fireflies flickered along the fence line. She would lean into him, content, and he'd rest a hand over hers, thumb brushing the back of her knuckles like a promise already kept. They never spoke of what had come before, not out of shame, but because the life they'd built now was too full for shadows. And in that quiet valley, with the house strong around them and the land steady beneath their boots, they lived the long years in peace, weathering storms, raising children, and growing old with the kind of love that asks nothing but presence and gives everything in return.